Hey guys, tonight we step off a creaking wooden gangway into a world rinsed in moonlight and silence, where the air grips your lungs like a careful fist, and your eyelashes try to knit themselves into a tiny scarf. The sea is black glass scattered with star chips, and somewhere beyond the rail, a penguin heckles you in a tuxedo it didn't iron. You set one boot onto sea ice that sighs like an old floorboard, and you feel that dizzy wobble between bravery and the smarter idea of going back to bed. Here's the cheeky reality check. If you actually tried this in sneakers and a hoodie, you probably wouldn't survive the hour. Antarctica is the planet's Do Not Tap the Glass exhibit. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you, because we're crossing many time zones together tonight. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge from the ship's shadow into a brightness that has no temperature except biting. Your boots squeak on wind-polished crust. The sound is so clean you could shelve it beside crystal goblets. The ship behind you, timbers laboring, rigging humming, feels like a hearth the size of a street, and you catch the faintest breath of coal smoke and something tannic. A whisper that says the kettle has thoughts of you. Overhead, clouds drag their sleeves across a low sun, turning the horizon into a silver ruler laid on white paper. Your breath steams, fogging the edges of your vision like the world itself is exhaling with you. Somewhere in your pocket, your fingers check for a tin of sugar like a talisman. It's funny how courage comes in spoonfuls. You crouch, gloved hands grazing a seam in the ice, listening to the ocean's slow percussion beneath. This is not the picturesque snow globe you were promised. This is a factory of cold. And yet, even here, tea matters. The officers pretend it's about routine, about proper naval order and the sacred timing of watches, but you know the truth. Tea at the edge of the world is a small, legal miracle. You picture how it will go. The kettle letting off a prim little hiss, the steam sneaking into your scarf, the first sip that tells your blood to stop sulking. If courage comes in spoonfuls, warmth arrives by the mug, and the mug is the one part of civilization you can hold. You move with the landing party, boots thudding in sluggish rhythm, each step a vote that says stay. Ropes creak, a bosun mutters a poem made of weather, and a crate thumps onto the floe with the compact authority of winter itself. The quartermaster shouts the inventory like a church litany, biscuits, pemmican, scientific instruments, and somewhere in there, the quiet glory. Tea chests, sealed with wax and hope. A laugh snags in your throat because it feels ridiculous that leaves farmed under monsoon skies have stowed away to the underside of the world. Light joke number 1. It's the longest delivery route a tea bag ever took without complaining to customer service. You stand there and you can almost feel the timeline broadening under your soles. Between 1897 and 1922, the so-called heroic age, expeditions edge into this blankness in wooden ships. Scott on Discovery, Shackleton on Nimrod and later Endurance, Amundsen slicing south with a different philosophy entirely. That's your mainstream historical fact, as solid as the ice underfoot, though even facts feel fragile in the cold. You imagine their first steps too, the breath, the sudden humility that arrives like a stern teacher. You're not here to plant flags in the first moments. You're just here to stand upright without shivering your brain loose. A gull wheels over the open lead like a lowercase letter, and beyond the floe, the pack ice buckles in a tic-tac-toe of pressure ridges. You flex your fingers and hear the leather creak. The sound is cozy the way a dog's sigh is cozy. The petty officer in charge taps his watch, a little theater to say time matters more than the landscape suggests. He's right, in a way. Time is a tyrant here. You can't negotiate with a sun that refuses to set, or a frost that files complaints directly to your marrow. Still, you let yourself drift for one luxurious minute into imagining that first cup, because the brain needs a soft place to land. Light joke number 2. You promise yourself you'll drink it so slowly, the molecules will send a strongly worded memo. You remember reading diary scraps before the voyage? Ink cramped by gloves, sentences clipped by cold, where a small ritual becomes a lighthouse in the skull. A quirky tidbit. Some sledging parties dried used tea leaves on a plate near the stove to steep them again the next day, a thrift that would make your barista faint, but probably saved a few tempers.
You make a mental note to treat every leaf like it's a tiny green diplomat with a very important mission. And yes, you side-eye the mustache of the man next to you. It's hoarding frost the way a pastry holds powdered sugar. The ice laughs at vanity. You reckon with danger the way you might nod to a neighbor. Politely, often. The flow pops under you like a knuckle. Somewhere a seal exclaims in punctuation you can't translate. You tuck your chin into wool and let your thoughts slide to practical magic. How the world's simplest brew becomes a firewall for morale. Historians still argue whether Scott's last journey broke mainly under weather, logistics, or the implacable math of distance. But even the sharpest critics admit the morale economy mattered. Spirits rose and fell with heat, calories, and the promise of something comforting in a mug. You add your own quiet footnote. Morale is not an abstract noun. It's a liquid, steaming brown. The bosun signals, and the line of you starts back toward the gangway, arms pumping for warmth. Your shadow stretches like an old scarf thrown across ice ridges. Somewhere on the ship, the galley clatters like friendly cookware gossip. You breathe in and name the scents: coal, wet rope, a ghost of tobacco. And then the shy one, Tannin, shy as a library attendant. Light joke number 3. If scents were a brass band, tea would be the triangle. Tiny, but absolutely necessary for the song to make sense. You reach the rail and the ship leans under your boots, a wooden iron animal purring low. You pat the bulwark like you would a horse, as if it too appreciates a good drink. You pause once more on the edge, looking back across the silent chessboard of ice. The sun hangs there like a coin too bright to spend, and the wind rehearses its lines in your ear. You think about Karsten Borch-Grevink's crew overwintering at Cape Adair at the turn of the century, the first people to stay on the Antarctic continent itself, learning the difference between bravado and patience. You can almost hear their mugs chime, little bells marking survival rather than ceremony. It occurs to you that tea here isn't nostalgia, it's strategy disguised as comfort. A plan in a porcelain suit. And now, as the gangway thumps and the ship eases her shoulder against the flow, you hitch your pack higher and file the moment away. The edge of ice is not a line you cross once, it's a conversation you'll keep having with cold and time and the odd penguin with opinions. Behind you, a kettle begins to sing, the quietest anthem of empire and error and endurance. You turn toward the sound as if it's your name, already knowing that when someone asks, years from now, what Antarctica felt like, you'll say white yes, wind yes, but mostly the humble, homeward tug of a warm mug waiting. You step inside to meet it. You shoulder a crate and crunch inland a dozen paces to the spot the mate jabs with his mitten, a patch of wind-shaved snow that looks like someone ironed the earth. You stamp a rectangle with your boots, left, right, left, feeling the crust collapse into powder, making a soft platform the size of a bedroom rug. It's comically domestic to be marking out floor space in a place that doesn't even admit to having a ceiling. Yet here you are, drawing a house on the page with your feet, because a kettle will need a windbreak and you, apparently, are the architect. You slide the crate down and pry the lid, nails squealing like seagulls. Inside, canvas, poles, a tangle of guys, and that peculiar, comforting smell of tarred rope and long travel. The tent is a pyramid, the British favorite, 4 sides and a single mind, descended from polar designs championed by Fridtjof Nansen and embraced on Scott's and Shackleton's journeys. That's your mainstream historical fact. The pyramid tent traveled south as standard kit, with sodcloths to seal the hem and long guys that end in buried anchors. You can almost hear 1,000 tent pegs shivering in sympathy across time. You work the pole into its socket, then lift, the canvas rising like a slow breath. Another pair of hands catches a guy. A hiss of line through wool mittens sounds like a match being struck very, very gently. You bury dead men in the snow. No pegs here, only lengths of wood or canvas bags filled with snow, laid sideways and entombed under drifts. You tug each one like you're checking a friend's sleeve for stubbornness. The tent settles, creaks, sighs. It already wants to be a home. Now the wall. You draw your snow knife, its blade dull by design so it won't stick, and you carve blocks from a nearby drift. The snow tells its story in layers, sugar, then styrofoam, then old wind pressed into crystal. You stack blocks waist-high, horseshoe-shaped around the lee side of the tent, leaving a little gap where the Primus will sit and sing. Light joke number 1. Congratulations. You've just built a cafe patio where the weather is always dramatic. If anyone asks about your opening hours, Tell them you're closed during blizzards and also during not blizzards. The wind experiments with your wall immediately, poking fingers through the seams, testing your geometry. You thicken it, add a second course, press the blocks inward until the flaws lock as one. Snow is honest material. It rewards patience and punishes ego. A spray of spindrift ghosts over the top like flour shaken onto a board. And you wonder briefly if the whole continent is one slow bakery. You're the baker who wants a single perfect loaf, a pocket of calm where a flame won't sputter out mid-sigh. Boxes arrive, sliding belly first over the snow behind a pair of laughing deckhands. Tea chests, oak-slatted, zinc-lined, corners banded in metal. They thud down with the authority of punctuation, and you nudge two of them into the curve of your wall, lids outward, to make a little bench and a little shelf. Quirky tidbit: more than one expedition kept using empty tea chests as bedside tables, shelves, even improvised steps. A few got painted, labeled like furniture, and stubbornly refused to return to their shipping destiny. You pat a lid as if it's a dog that fetched firewood. The Primus comes out, squat and earnest, brass catching a reluctant gleam. You prime it with a splash, cup the match in your glove cave, and coax blue into being. The flame focuses your whole brain like a lens. Every tiny falter in the wind reads as temper. You set the kettle, a blackened hoosh pot veteran, on the rings. The snow wall does its job. Steam lifts, delicate as lace, then becomes a flag. The kettle puts its chin out the way old men do when they're about to tell a story. Light joke number 2. If this kettle had a LinkedIn, its skills would list boiling and morale management, endorsed by everyone here. Around you, more pyramids sprout, each with its own snow half-moon, each with a little stove waiting to earn hero status. Someone stacked biscuit tins into a second screen, labels facing outward like a tiny dry goods storefront. Welcome to the Emporium, you say, because the brain insists on naming things. The wind slides by, baffled, like a cat realizing this box actually belongs to the human. You fish the tea tin from your parka, its rattle both stingy and generous, and set it where the heat can nudge fragrance free. It takes a thoughtful minute for snow to become water, to become promise. In that minute, you scan the camp. Sledges turned sideways for shelter, skis laid over drift mouths like lids, canvas doors flicking open and shut with tiny dramatic flares. You catch a smell of blubber smoke from a shore party's rough stove. Some expeditions used seal or penguin blubber for fuel at the permanent huts, a greasy compromise that tattooed the air, and you're suddenly grateful for the Primus's cleaner, more civilized whisper. Historians still argue whether the early British devotion to order, neat camps, scheduled brews, and ritual tea in a captain's tent, conserved strength or merely conserved dignity. But as your wall edits the wind into a polite murmur, you vote for strength with each stacked block. The kettle chatters, then trills. You lift it and pour a ribbon into the pot, leaves tumbling like confetti at a somber parade. The first scent hits, tannin, faintly floral, a memory of far-off rain. You remember yesterday's thrifty trick, drying used leaves near the stove, and slide that plate closer to warm their second life. The steam fogs your lashes, frost beads there, turn soft needles back into jewelry. You stir with a spoon whose handle has acquired a polite crook over many fires, and you grin because even the spoon seems to lean into the gale. You lay out the mugs, tin, enamel, a chipped bit of china that insists on being here like a duchess at a barn dance, and ladle carefully. Each cup is a small planet with its own weather, some clouded with condensed milk, some dusky and neat, one sugared to the point of sculpture. The first sip is an audition for joy. The second is the job itself. Light joke number 3. By the third sip, you find yourself writing a stern letter to your past self, forever doubting hot brown leaf soup as a life strategy. One deckhand perches on a tea chest and sighs, a delicate whistling sigh that sounds exactly like a kettle at low confidence. Another props his boots against the wall, snow melting and refreezing into a glistening glaze. Conversation thaws, becomes the soft clink of spoons, the tiny orchestras that live in mugs. Someone claims they once balanced a kettle in a whiteout by bracing it with 2 frozen socks. Questionable engineering that wins a round of dubious applause. You mark the story down in your mind's scrapbook of improbable success. Your tent flap ticks like a metronome, counting out a tempo for survival. You tuck the tea tin back into its nest, wrap the spoon in a rag, and run a hand along the snow wall's top, smoothing it the way you might smooth a quilt corner. This, you realize, is how civilization travels. Tents for roofs, boxes for furniture, a wall to persuade the wind to use its indoor voice, and the one device that can make boiling water feel like a fully developed philosophy. The sky does a trick with light, a brass bright gleam slipping under a low cloud, and the whole camp glows as if lit from inside. Your breath plumes in lazy commas. You seal the tent hem with drifted snow, patting it until the fabric sits flush, then thread a line from the pole to a buried ski. Insurance against the night's gusts. The kettle goes back for a rehearse, a small encore. In the hush between bubbles, you imagine writing this home. Dear whoever is warm, today we built a wall so the kettle could live its best life. Later, when the day stretches like taffy and the wind tries a new key, the wall will need patching, the guys a retention, the dead men a check. That's fine. You've learned the rhythm already. Cut, stack, pour, sip, repair, repeat. There's nobility in chores done well, even when your audience is a sullen horizon and a penguin that disapproves of your masonry. You raise your mug to the bird anyway. It blinks, blinks again, then leaves without tipping. Customers. Before you duck into the tent, you glance down the row of pyramids and their curled snow arms, a colony of small resistances arranged against a continent. Somewhere at the far end, a captain's tent has its own private wall and a more careful kettle, and you know you'll be invited there later to behave and sip and pretend the china isn't glued. For now, you nudge your stove, listen to the soft approval in its flame, and let the warmth settle in your bones like a polite guest who intends to overstay, if you'll allow it. You squat beside the little cafe patio you built in the snow, your horseshoe wall, your Primus throne, and consider the fuel puzzle like a chef who's inherited a kitchen with 3 ingredients: coal, blubber, and audacity. The air is so dry it squeaks. Even your thoughts seem to crackle as they move. You pat the Primus's brass belly the way you might soothe a nervous dog. You're about to ask it to do a magic trick in a place where fire feels like a rumor. Coal first. You tip open a canvas sack and out tumble lumps as black as midnight on a typewriter ribbon. They thud into your palm with the stony honesty of geology, and you remember the ship's heaving stores, hundreds of sacks lashed under hatches, each one a ticket to boiled water and a full kettle chorus. Mainstream historical fact: the early Antarctic huts, Discovery at Hut Point, Shackleton's at Cape Royds, Scott's at Cape Evans, were stacked with coal brought south by the ship, a strategy that bought clean heat when the blubber stove gummed up the world. Coal is reliable if heavy, and heavy is a scandalous word when every ounce argues with distance. You set a few celebratory chunks in a tidy pyramid like you're proposing a monument to warmth. Then there's blubber. Seals glide under the ice like upholstered torpedoes, and when shore parties worked, they used the fat the way the Arctic peoples always had. Burnt as fuel, eaten as calories, respected as the one substance that refuses to forget the sun. The blubber stove, when it's going, smells like the ghost of a fish market that married a candle shop. Greasy soot varnishes everything. When you come out of a blubber session, you shine like a well-seasoned frying pan. You keep a separate set of blubber clothes because there's only so much Oda Penguin neighborhood that your tent mates will politely applaud. Light joke number 1. It's the only cologne that guarantees you'll get a seat to yourself. You run a thumb across the Primus's pump leather and feed it a drop of oil. The stove is a tiny pressurized democracy. You build a little pressure, preheat with a thimble of spirit, and when the brass warms, paraffin vaporizes into a blue, well-behaved flame that sings like a kettle learning scales. Another historical fact with a wink: the Primus, a Swedish invention from the 1890s, rode south with the explorers and changed the math of survival. Nansen loved it, so Scott and Shackleton loved it, and soon everyone pretended they had always loved it. You strike a match and the flame blinks on. The sound it makes, a rapid, even purr, turns you into a believer. Of course, wind behaves like a sous chef who cannot take a hint. It slaps your pot, steals heat, and sprays snow into the priming cup with the tact of a toddler at a bird bath. You set the stove into an empty biscuit tin, your improvised windscreen, and angle it behind your snow wall until the blue stays true. Quirky tidbit: some sledging parties christen their stoves with names, Blue Mary, Singing Tom, as if a little flattery might keep them from tantrums. You tell yours it's doing a spectacular job, then bribe it with another careful pump. You weigh your options like a quartermaster with a lover's worry. Coal burns hot but demands a hearth and a chimney. and a willingness to smell faintly Victorian. Blubber requires tending, and emits the kind of black smoke that powders the rafters and your eyebrows. Paraffin carries beautifully on sledges, but leaks are legendary little tragedies. Historians still argue whether the fuel losses on Scott's 1911-12 Polar March, those heartbreaking half-empty cans, the faint film of paraffin on snow, owed more to flawed soldering, rough handling, or simple miscalculation, and how much that arithmetic of heat contributed to the catastrophe that followed. You touch the seam of a tin, as if your glove could promise tightness, as if gloved promises ever count in the cold. You pour a capful of meths into the priming cup, light it, and watch the little yellow flirting turn to blue devotion. When you hear the Primus settle into its working voice, you perch the hoosh pot, blackened from 1,000 meals, on the ring. The wind tries the wall, finds it stubborn, and backs off in a sulk. The flame licks the pot accepts the compliment, steam begins a quiet monologue. You grin because this is the kind of theater you like. Quiet, efficient, intermission optional. Now you test the universes. It's the coals for the hut nights when the whole gang gathers, boots steaming by the hearth, voices low and story-shaped. Blubbers for shore camps. For days when seals gift fat like currency, and the chimney needs a new reason to exist. Paraffins for the road, the plateau, the white highway where every ounce on the sledge is a courtroom drama. You take a ceremonial sniff at each option and laugh because your nose, like a good diplomat, refuses to rank allies. Light joke number 2. If there were Michelin stars for polar fuels, the inspectors would turn up their collars and take a sudden interest in salad. Your mind drifts to the Nansen cooker, a fireless, haybox-style nesting pot that traps heat like a miser traps coins. Boil once, tuck it in, let it finish itself while the stove naps. That trick saves liquid fuel and tempers impatience. You improvise a version with a blanket wrapped around your pot, and the Primus looks relieved to have a break from proving itself. The kettle sings, then hushes as the lid trembles. In the stillness, snow hisses against canvas like sand on a faraway beach. For a second, you are in 2 climates at once. Someone wanders over, fanning the air theatrically. Blubber or paraffin today? They ask, nose wrinkled in the universal language of curiosity and self-preservation. You point at the Primus and shrug. How's special, you say. Notes of brass and triumph. They laugh and set a small bundle in the snow. Penguin guano, sun-dried on a flat stone near the rookery, crumbly as cork. Quirky, but let's call it a misadventure tidbit. More than one winterer tried a handful of dried guano as kindling in a pinch. Results described variously as surprisingly lively and an insult that lingered. Historians still argue whether those diary lines were practical notes or pranks aimed squarely at the future's gullible readers. You decide not to test it today. Your tent mates have suffered enough. You measure paraffin with the concentration of a jeweler because spill is loss and loss shrinks horizons. The can sighs, the spout gleams, and the smell is sharp as a new pencil. You wipe the threads and tighten the cap, taking pride in a seam that refuses to weep. On sledging days, you'll portion fuel into daily ration bottles, each one a promise of 2 hot meals and a brew. With a little reserve for the night, the wind eats your patience. You picture the plateau ahead, where altitude will lower water's boiling point, and your tea will taste like it's been made by a barista who lost a bet. Light joke number 3. 5 stars for ambience, 3 for temperature, would steep again. Steam thickens into behavior. You lift the lid and the bubbles look like silver buttons marching in neat ranks. You tilt your ear, the note is right. You're learning to hear temperatures the way some people hear keys. You pour a little into the pot with its curled leaves, and the scent blooms so quickly it feels like time has cheated and skipped ahead to comfort. The Primus keeps purring and you stroke its tank, one grateful thumb. The wall holds, the wind mutters, the universe approves. You keep coal in a tidy pile, covered with a bit of canvas against drift, each lump a future evening of civilized conversation. You keep blubber wrapped and hung, away from opportunistic skuas who would happily repossess your fuel. You keep paraffin tins tucked under a sledge, insulated by snow so temperature swings don't jolt the seals. The choreography is domestic and martial at once. Fold, stow, lash, check. Because here, logistics is love. You'll nurse the Primus leather, polish jets with a pin when they clog, and speak gently to valves that wait grumpy. Tools have tempers. Treat them like co-workers you can't replace.
When the kettle reaches its operatic high C, you pull it off and let the Primus breathe.
Flame drops, sound softens, and the cold steps closer like a polite guest returning after a smoke. You set the kettle beside your bench of tea chests, still the best cafe seats on the barrier, and feel the heat kiss the air. You pour, and that ribbon of water is everything you came for, hidden inside everything you have to manage. The first sip is permission. The second is policy. You glance at your fuel altar, coal, blubber, paraffin, and nod at all three as if you're chairing an awkward meeting. They will all get their turn. The frozen desert doesn't make exceptions. It merely watches to see who can do arithmetic while their fingers are numb. You can, you will. And with the stove whispering and the kettle sighing and the wall standing at small watch, you raise your cup to the dry, bright silence and drink to the stubbornness of flame. You brush a palm across the side of a crate, knocking off frost that has crystallized into something that looks suspiciously like cake icing. Inside is no cake, unless your definition of sponge and jam is splintery wood and zinc lining. But what you do find is treasure measured in ounces rather than carats. You prise up the lid, and there it is, a chest of tea. Oak boards, iron nails, and wax seals, all the way from London docks to the farthest edge of the earth. You grin because this box has traveled more miles than most human beings will see in a lifetime. You crack open the wax like a priest opening a reliquary. Inside are packets wrapped in paper and lead foil, stamped with shipping marks, the leaves still dark, curled, and faintly fragrant even after months at sea. Mainstream historical fact. British expeditions at the turn of the 20th century shipped their tea in strong chests lined with lead foil, designed to protect from damp and rodents alike. The weight was enormous, but the alternative, no tea, was considered practically mutiny bait. You can almost hear the London clerk's pen scratching. The dockside tally shouted across the quay, the long haul around the Horn, and the final arrival here in white silence. You lift a packet close to your nose. Against the background scents of rope, grease, and penguin life, it smells like faraway rain. You rub a leaf between gloved fingers and it crumbles into dust, a tiny cloud that clings like perfume. Quirky tidbit. Some explorers claimed they could judge the quality of a batch by how quickly the dust perfumed the tent, while others swore you had to chew a leaf to hear its honesty. You decline to chew. Your teeth have enough complaints. The quartermaster hovers, pen and mitten, ready to log how many pounds are drawn. Every ounce here is rationed, catalogued, argued over. On paper, each man might be allotted an ounce a day, enough for 2 strong brews. In practice, watches blur, sledging rations vary, and someone always insists their mug is larger, therefore morally entitled to more. Historians still argue whether rationing was too tight on Scott's southern journey in 1911, whether a few extra ounces would have saved tempers or even lives, or whether it would have simply meant carrying a few pounds more weight across a continent that already hated every pound. You set aside a few packets, wrapping them in cloth and tying them with a line for sledging days. Those will be the traveling tea, tucked next to biscuit and pemmican. The rest stays in the chest, reburied in snow and labeled like treasure on a pirate map. Tea, do not touch. You imagine a future archaeologist finding it intact, shaking their head that humanity once hauled leaves to the most expensive refrigerator in the world. Light joke number 1. The whole continent is basically the world's biggest walk-in freezer, and you're the fussy chef demanding one particular shelf just for oolong. The men gather, mugs already in hand like pilgrims at a shrine. You measure with theatrical precision, 1 spoon per mug, 1 for the pot. The tin spoon rattles, the sound ridiculously homey against the backdrop of shrieking wind. The kettle sits ready, humming, like it knows it's about to be promoted to the role of hero. You pour, the leaves swirl, and suddenly the tent is a perfumery. Someone mutters civilization in a cup, and no one laughs because it's true. As you ladle the first mugs, you think of the chain of people behind this. The pickers in Assam or Ceylon bending to pluck, the chests shipped across oceans, the London merchants with ledgers, the dockers, the sailors, the officers who argued about which blend to order for the expedition. All that human choreography for this moment, this sip, this second where your frost-bitten fingers thaw just enough to remember they're yours. Light joke number 2. If globalization ever needed a mascot, it would be you, crouched on Antarctica, hugging a tin mug, thanking 6 continents for your caffeine. The quartermaster does his rounds, noting consumption like a taxman at a wedding. The numbers matter. Run out of tea early, and morale dips into something darker than hunger. Stretch it too thin, and every brew tastes like regret steeped in water. The balance is alchemy. You sip carefully, knowing that this cup is both comfort and a ledger entry. Someone pulls out a diary, scrawling, "First cup ashore, tasted like England." You smile because tea is not only a beverage here, it's memory insurance. In each swallow is a promise that beyond this endless ice, there are parlors and firesides, brass kettles and cheerful neighbors. Even if that's half fantasy, it's worth more than calories.
Historians may still argue whether tea mattered more as fuel or as morale, but you decide not to split the leaf. Both are true, and both are in your mug. You glance back at the chest, its lid resealed, snow drifted around it like a white blanket. It waits, patient as a banker, holding the expedition's liquid equity. Coal may keep you alive. Pemmican may push you onward, but tea keeps you willing. Light joke number 3. Explorers don't run on steam. They run on steam plus tannins, with sugar optional. As the mug's empty and the kettle cools, you feel the moment slide into memory. The first crate opened, the first packet unwrapped, the first proper brew on the ice. It is a ceremony disguised as logistics. Tomorrow it will feel routine. Tonight it feels like christening a ship, except this ship sails in your veins. You lick your lips and find a ghost of sweetness there. The chest settles into the snow. The ice blinks. And you, with tea warming you from inside out, finally feel less like a trespasser and more like a tenant who has paid first month's rent. You set your mug down on the snow wall and glance around the tent, realizing the next question is not what goes into the kettle, but what you'll drink it from. Because here, mugs are less about aesthetics and more about survival, though a little bit of vanity sneaks in too. Some men are still clinging to porcelain teacups. Yes, porcelain, hauled thousands of miles and padded like fine china at a wedding gift registry. Others are already making do with whatever doesn't leak. You lift one porcelain cup, hairline cracks running through its glaze like the veins on an old hand. It has traveled from a London kitchen to the South Pole fringe, and it still insists on being held daintily. Mainstream historical fact. On Scott's expeditions, officers often drank from actual porcelain, sometimes even with matching saucers, while the men used tin mugs or enamel cups. The formality was part of keeping naval hierarchy intact, even in a tent where everyone was equally frostbitten. You sip from the fragile cup, pretending you're in a drawing room. The steam immediately fogs your eyelashes, ruining the effect. You trade it for a tin mug, battered, dented, and efficient. The tin chills instantly in your hand, sticking to a bit of moisture on your glove. You yank your hand free, leaving behind a ghostly imprint. The taste of tea from tin is sharp, faintly metallic like chewing on pennies, but after a few gulps you forget, because warmth is its own seasoning. Quirky tidbit. Some men swore their mugs developed personalities, dent by dent, and even named them Old Billy or Miss Pennyworth, as if the cup itself were another sledging companion. You run a finger along the dent at the rim and think it really does resemble a crooked smile. The lower ranks often improvise further. A sardine tin, emptied and scorched clean, makes a serviceable cup, if you don't mind a faint aftertaste of fish blending with your Darjeeling. Someone once used a penguin eggshell, rinsed and hardened over the fire, as a vessel, though it cracked before the brew was gone. One man swears he saw another sip from a boot, though that may have been either exaggeration or punishment. Light joke number 1. If you ever see boot tea on a cafe menu, I'd recommend politely leaving. The kettle whistles again, steam hissing around the lid like a secret trying to escape. You ladle more into the mismatched lineup. Porcelain aristocrat, tin democrat, sardine experimentalist. Each vessel steams in its own accent. The officers, perched on tea chests, lift their china with deliberate calm, while the men squat on their heels, blowing across tin lips. Same tea, different story. You find it strangely touching that hierarchy can survive even in a tent that flaps like a bad umbrella. Historians still argue whether this insistence on naval ceremony, china cups, order of pouring, posture while sipping, was dignified or delusional. You lean toward dignified, mostly because the china makes you laugh at the absurdity of it. Someone drops their mug in the snow. The tea bleeds out in a dark patch, quickly freezing into brown ice. Everyone groans as though treasure has been lost, because it has. The poor soul scoops it up, scoffs at the wasted drink, then shrugs and ladles another, more careful this time.
Light joke number 2. If gravity had a sense of humor, it would specialize in knocking over hot drinks in Antarctica. You try the enamel mug next, its chipped lip smoothed by years of impatient gulps. Enamel holds heat just enough to burn your tongue, a rite of passage everyone has endured. The blue paint flakes into pale constellations, reminding you of star maps you saw in a schoolroom. Only here the stars are on your mug instead of overhead. You think about writing a diary line. Drank Orion's belt today, tasted faintly of rust. In the corner, one man experiments with a makeshift handle carved from bone, wired to a mug so he can sip without burning fingers. Another ties a bit of string to his cup so he can dangle it from a hook, keeping it off the snow floor where spills and accidents lurk. Everyone here becomes a tinkerer. Everyone believes their mug hack will be remembered in expedition lore. It won't, but you admire the optimism. Outside the tent, the wind claws at the snow wall, but inside, cups clink, spoons tap, and conversation stirs as reliably as the tea. Someone jokes that Shackleton would have insisted on proper silver spoons if he thought they'd fit the budget. Someone else counters that Amundsen probably just drank from his hat and didn't bother with ceremony. You grin because that feels plausible. Amundsen, practical to the bone, wouldn't fuss about porcelain. As the tea dwindles, the mugs are set down in a row, little sentries cooling on the snow wall. You notice how the vessels tell the story of class, improvisation, and resilience more vividly than any flag. From fragile porcelain to battered tin, from sardine can to bone-handled contraption, they are all survival disguised as tableware. Light joke number 3. It's the world's least glamorous tea set, but you'd rather drink from a sardine tin here than a crystal goblet back home, mostly because the sardine tin won't judge your mittens. You gather the mugs, wipe them with a rag that freezes almost instantly, and tuck them back into packs or pockets. Each cup is a personal artifact now, carried close like a lucky coin. You feel the bond growing between you and your dented tin, scratched, scarred, and absolutely faithful. You give it a little pat, the way you might pat a dog's head. It doesn't wag its tail, but it does promise you tomorrow's tea will taste just as improbably civilized in the middle of nowhere. The kettle rests on the Primus with a low hiss, steam curling like a thin ghost, and now the attention turns to the final flourish. What exactly goes into the tea besides the leaves? You reach into a canvas bag and your fingers brush a tin of sugar, dented but still boasting its stenciled label. Sugar has made the same long voyage, bouncing over seas in barrels and tins, and now it sits here as if it were simply meant to be. Mainstream historical fact. Expeditions often carried condensed milk and sugar in large quantities, both for tea and for general rations, because the calories were precious and the morale boost priceless. Tea without sugar, many noted in their diaries, was barely tolerable. You spoon out the sugar, crystalline and eager, watching it tumble into mugs like snowfall in reverse. A few men grumble that their spoonful was smaller than the next, a chorus that proves sugar is currency here. You add another dash for yourself, calling it fair pay for the work of boiling water in a place that wants everything frozen. Quirky tidbit. Some sledging parties actually measured sugar rations by the ounce, doling out each man's portion into little bags, so that running short didn't turn into accusations of theft. Even so, it was said some men licked the empty bags, determined not to waste a single grain. You look at your spoon, consider the absurdity, and think, yes, you'd lick the bag too. Then there's the condensed milk. You heft a small tin, thick metal sweating with cold, and punch 2 holes in the top with a nail. The contents ooze like pale syrup, a sluggish river unwilling to leave its can. You coax it with your spoon, watching the swirl in your mug cloud from black to caramel to a pale beige that resembles toffee. The milk is sweet enough to double as dessert, a substitute for cream and a lifeline when other food feels monotonous. Light joke number 1. It's the only time in life you'll find people genuinely fighting over who gets to drink evaporated cow juice. The ritual of milk and sugar has its own rules, and naturally, opinions clash. One officer insists the milk should go in before the tea to prevent scalding the flavor. Another swears the tea must go in first so the milk can swirl in dramatically. The argument runs in circles, both sides quoting their grandmothers as ultimate authority. You sip quietly, unwilling to betray your loyalties, but amused that on a continent where everything freezes solid, men still find time to debate beverage etiquette. Historians still argue whether this ritual mattered for discipline, or was simply a way to cling to normalcy. Either way, The arguments were real enough to make diaries. You taste the result. Hot, sweet, heavy enough that it clings to your teeth, but satisfying in a way no plain brew could be here. Your lips form a sigh you didn't plan, the kind of sigh usually reserved for warm blankets and Sunday afternoons. A shipmate beside you drains his mug in one swallow, smacks his lips, and asks for seconds like a child at a fair. The quartermaster growls, but pours anyway. When supplies run low, the real drama begins. Sugar gets rationed more tightly, and condensed milk sometimes vanishes entirely. That's when improvisations appear. A spoonful of golden syrup, a dollop of seal fat, or, in desperation, simply pretending the tea tastes richer than it is. One diary mentions stirring snow into cold tea to pretend it was iced rather than simply ruined. Light joke number 2. Congratulations, you've just invented the world's saddest frappuccino. On sledging journeys, the system grows stricter. Each man receives a lump of sugar to carry in his pocket, hard as glass, to nibble or dissolve in his mug at camp. Condensed milk, too bulky to carry in cans, is left behind, so sledging tea is usually plain and sharp, stripped of its comfort. You imagine the longing in those moments, the envy when reading about milk back in camp, the secret wish to trade a glove for just one spoonful. You stir your mug again, listening to the spoon clink like a metronome. The warmth climbs your arms, unfreezing joints that had quietly turned to stone. Conversation fills the tent like smoke. Someone jokes that if Scott had brought twice as much condensed milk, he would have been knighted twice as quickly. Someone else counters that too much milk would have slowed the sledges and ended the expedition at the coast. Both laugh, because even here, the logic of tea stretches further than reason. The kettle empties, and you scrape the last clingy stripes of milk from the tin, licking your spoon with no shame. Around you, the mugs sit in a neat row on the snow bench, each one drained down to the faint stain at the bottom, proof of small happiness. Light joke number 3. If tea leaves could talk, they'd probably apply for hazard pay. You seal the sugar tin, press the lid on tight, and wrap the remaining condensed milk with more care than you'd give to jewelry. These are luxuries, yes, but they're also morale insurance policies. The difference between grumbling and laughter tomorrow. You tuck them into the box under biscuits and ropes, safe from the frost and safer still from prying hands. When you step outside the tent, the world is unchanged. White horizon, black sea, wind rehearsing its endless play. But your blood hums warmer, your lips taste of sweetness, and you know why men wrote home about their mugs as though they were letters themselves. You raise the empty can toward the horizon like a toast and whisper thanks to the unseen cows of faraway fields. Out here, even gratitude gets rationed, but for this moment, you have enough. You cradle your mug in between your hands, savoring the lingering sweetness from the condensed milk, and you realize you're not just drinking, you're holding currency. In Antarctica, tea isn't merely a beverage, it's the gold standard, the soft economy that keeps tempers from sliding into mutiny. Mainstream historical fact. In both Arctic and Antarctic expeditions, tea was rationed as carefully as pemmican or biscuit, its value recognized not in calories but in morale. Men noted in diaries that a generous pour could smooth over quarrels, and a withheld ration could spark a sulk that lasted for days. You remember yesterday's small favor, help hauling a stubborn sledge, a rope frozen solid, and the way it earned you an extra half spoon of sugar. The transaction was silent, casual, but it had the weight of law. One man bartered an evening of sewing repairs for an additional cup. Another swapped lookout duty during a storm for the promise of a second mug in the captain's tent. Tea is IOUs written in steam. Quirky tidbit. On at least one wintering expedition, men joked about drawing up an official tea exchange where credits could be traded like stocks, with the sugar tin as the bank vault. You suspect it wasn't entirely a joke. The power of tea runs deeper than barter. It shapes mood. A tin mug passed at the right time turns frostbitten silence into laughter. A captain sharing from his own private stash turns discipline into loyalty. Light joke number 1. Forget Wall Street. If you want to study market psychology, just watch 6 frozen men negotiating over who gets the last spoonful of condensed milk. The kettle whistles again, and you ladle carefully, measuring the leaves so no one accuses you of favoritism. A voice behind you mutters, "Go on, give him the big scoop, he earned it." Another chimes in, "He didn't earn anything except frost on his mustache." The banter is sharp, but softened by steam. The truth is, everyone knows morale comes one mug at a time, Historians still argue whether expeditions that allowed more generous tea rations fared better, or whether the difference was only psychological. But down here, psychology is not a luxury. It's a survival tool. You sip, and the warmth floods your ribs. A man beside you digs in his pocket and pulls out a hard sugar lump wrapped in a twist of paper. He drops it in with reverence, watching it dissolve as though it were alchemy. That's his treasure saved for this moment, a choice made against hunger but in favor of happiness. You nod, understanding the gamble. Sometimes a little joy buys more endurance than another 100 calories. The barter continues quietly. A length of twine swapped for the last dribble in the kettle, a promise to mend a boot in exchange for a refill. You even catch someone offering to tell a good story, an honest-to-God story, for half a spoon of sugar. Light joke number 2. Imagine if all economies ran on storytelling and tea, the stock market might actually be bearable. Later, when the mugs are empty and the snow wall rattles with a fresh gust, you hear whispers of men hiding private leaves, folded in cloth, tucked into socks. Contraband? Or just personal insurance? No one says aloud, but everyone knows. It's a dangerous line to walk. Hoarding risks resentment, but generosity buys friends. One officer famously opened his personal tin during a storm, handing out mugs with a shrug. Diaries say the effect was instant. Laughter, chatter, even a song in the middle of howling wind. You think about that and tuck the lesson into your pocket. In Antarctica, sharing is leadership. Still, not all trades end well. A man once promised an extra mug in return for a spare mitten, only to find the kettle empty by the time he returned. The grudge lasted weeks, the sort of petty bitterness that frostbite alone couldn't cause. You sip your tea, knowing full well that these tiny grievances can snowball faster than any drift outside. Tea is peace when managed wisely. It's war when mismanaged. You glance at your dented mug, the one you've quietly claimed as your own. It feels heavier now, as though it's holding not just liquid, but the weight of unspoken agreements. Light joke number 3. If mugs could talk, they'd demand back pay and sugar for all the arguments they've settled. The kettle finally breathes its last sigh, and the Primus flame dwindles. Men lick spoons, scrape mugs, tilt them to catch the faintest residue. No one wastes a drop. Outside, the snow hisses against the tent, but inside, the warmth of tea lingers like a treaty signed in steam. You stretch your legs, sigh, and know that tomorrow, when the day grinds on with wind and hauling and frostbite whispers, the real question won't be about roots or rations. It will be about whether someone will trade you half a spoonful, or whether you'll be generous enough to give one away. The kettle's lid rattles with impatience, a tiny percussion that tells you it's time to serve again, and you notice how naturally the rhythm slots into the expedition's daily schedule. Out here, tea isn't just a drink. It's the punctuation that keeps the sentences of the day from running into each other. You measure out leaves, tip in water, and already your body knows what comes next. Mainstream historical fact. On naval voyages and Antarctic expeditions alike, the day was broken into watches, with bells marking the shifts, and tea woven into those intervals like clockwork. Even in this ice wilderness, bells ring, watches change, and mugs get filled. You hear it in the routine. Dawn's gray light smudging the horizon, a bell clanging faintly from the ship, and almost immediately the Primus hisses awake. That first brew is less about pleasure and more about bracing. Fuel before men trudge into the snow to haul sledges or chip ice. Later in the day, when the sun circles stubbornly overhead without really setting, another bell marks the next watch. Right on cue, mugs appear, hands outstretched. Tea has become the expedition's metronome. The ritual travels onto the ice as well. When sledging parties strike out, their ration packs are carefully portioned. Biscuit, pemmican, cocoa for supper, and always tea for breakfast and lunch. Quirky tidbit, some sledgers grew so attached to their schedule that they claimed they could taste the hour in their mug, swearing morning tea had a different flavor from evening tea, even though it was the same leaves. Perhaps it was just exhaustion seasoning the brew, or perhaps they weren't entirely wrong. In camp, the routine is theater. Someone checks the watch, clears their throat, and announces with mock gravity, "Gentlemen, it is time." Even the most exhausted men shuffle toward the kettle as though summoned by law. You can't help but smile. Light joke number 1. If tea time were enforced this strictly back home,
Half the empire would have shown up to work late but very caffeinated. You pour into the row of mugs, tin, enamel, porcelain, the sardine can improvisation, and conversation unfurls exactly as the schedule intends. A complaint about frostbitten fingers turns into laughter. A mutter about sledging ropes becomes a story. The tea isn't solving problems, but it's providing the stage where solutions can be rehearsed. You lean back, mug warm in your hands, and realize the kettle is more powerful than any officer's whistle. Out on the trail, the pattern is even more sacred. A team hauls for hours against the wind, every step an argument with the sledge's weight. When the leader finally raises a hand, the stop is blessed by more than rest. It's tea time. The stove is lit in a hollow scooped from the drift, the pot balanced carefully on blocks of snow, and the ritual plays out no matter how miserable the weather. Historians still argue whether the insistence on these scheduled pauses was practical energy management or psychological theater, but everyone agrees that skipping a brew would have been mutiny against the body itself. You picture a sledging crew huddled in a shallow trench, wind blasting their backs, steam from the kettle ripped sideways as soon as it rises. And yet there they are, pouring into mugs, blowing across the surface, sipping like monks at vespers. The world howls and they answer with silence broken only by the sound of swallowing. You tell yourself you'll remember that image later, when you need to remind yourself why order matters. The bell rings again on the ship, carried thinly across the ice, and you realize the cycle repeats without end. Watch, tea, work, tea, sleep, tea. It's less an expedition than a string of mugs threaded together. Light joke number 2. If archaeologists ever dig up this campsite centuries from now, they'll probably assume the explorers were just an unusually dedicated tea cult. Night comes, or rather, the sun lowers slightly and pretends. Inside the tents, men stir from half-sleep, hands reaching automatically for mugs even before eyes open. Tea at night is quieter, heavier, its steam curling into an air already thick with snores and mutters. It's not for chatter now, it's for reassurance. The schedule holds, even when time itself feels like it's slipping away. The kettle empties, and you hear the familiar scraping. Spoons against tin, the last dribble into enamel. Everyone settles back into their routines. Journals written, boots dried, gloves checked. Tea has marked another cycle closed. You glance at the watch yourself, nodding at the accuracy of the rhythm. Light joke number 3. You've officially become Pavlov's dog. Except instead of a bell meaning food, it means put the kettle on. You tuck the sugar tin away, polish the Primus with a rag, and settle your mug upside down in the snow wall to drain. Outside, the wind continues its endless performance. Inside, the schedule hums along, one mug after another. It's absurd, really, to think that in a place without clocks or nights, men still manage to tell time not by the sun, but by the gentle insistence of tea. You drag the sledge rope across your chest, the harness cutting into your shoulders like an argument you can't win, and every step grinds your bones against the weight. The plateau stretches ahead, white, indifferent, without punctuation. Wind claws your ears raw. You bend your head and keep moving, one foot into the soft crunch of the other's shadow. The word miserable comes to mind, but it feels too cheerful for this. Hours pass in the rhythm of haul, breath, stumble, repeat. Then, blessedly, the signal comes. The leader raises his mittened hand. The line of you collapses into the snow like exhausted dominoes. The sledge creaks to a halt, dogs panting clouds into the air. It's not just a rest, it's the promise of tea. The Primus is dragged out of its case, its brass body already scarred from previous battles with the wind. A hollow is scooped in the snow, sides smoothed with gloved hands, a little trench carved just deep enough to cradle flame. The match strikes, the preheating spirit flares, and soon the blue flame purrs. You set the blackened kettle over it, and already you can feel hope in your shoulders. Mainstream historical fact. Sledging parties during Scott's expeditions measured their marches by brew-ups, often dividing the day into 2 hauling sessions, each broken by the sacred pause for tea. The kettle was the reward that turned miles into something bearable. Steam finally snakes upward, shredded by the wind before it even reaches your face. You crouch low, mug ready, and when the first pour lands, you nearly weep. The heat seeps into your cracked lips. The tannins trick your stomach into believing it's more than liquid. It tastes like courage disguised as bitterness. Quirky tidbit. Some men insisted their best mug of tea was the one brewed with melted snow scraped from their own beards after hours of hauling. It sounds revolting, but desperation breeds inventiveness, and a salty undertone never hurt anyone too badly. The first sip after hauling is never graceful. You burn your tongue because you're too impatient, then hiss through your teeth like a tea kettle yourself. Around you, the others do the same. Tongues scalded, throats relieved, spirits inflated. Light joke number 1. Antarctic explorers might be the only people who could write "I blistered my tongue" in a diary and consider it a triumph. You sit on your heels, mug between hands, watching the steam blur your vision. For the first time since dawn, you let yourself breathe without timing it to the rope's drag. The dogs settle in a circle, paws tucked under, noses hidden. One curls against a sledge runner and snores immediately. You envy their efficiency. The tea loosens your body enough that you think you could almost nap right here. But the kettle isn't done. More mugs are filled, spoons clink, sugar lumps disappear into pockets. Someone jokes that today's brew tastes faintly of seal blubber, probably because the kettle wasn't scrubbed properly after supper. Someone else says it tastes like triumph. Both are correct. Historians still argue whether the caloric value of tea justified the fuss, given that it offered almost no nutrition compared to pemmican or biscuit. But no one doubts that morale was its own fuel. Without it, the rope would drag harder. With it, the rope seems just barely manageable. You sip slower now, letting the warmth spread along your ribs like ink bleeding into paper. Your hands thaw just enough to regain ownership of your fingers. The snow trench shields the flame, and you feel strangely safe in this tiny carved-out bubble, as though the storm itself has agreed to let you have this one small kindness. Light joke number 2. If you ever need proof that the universe has a heart, it's the fact that kettles boil faster when everyone stares at them in desperation. When the mugs are drained, a silence falls. Not tired silence, but satisfied silence. The kind that says, "Yes, I can go on." Someone licks their spoon. Someone else rattles the kettle for the last drop, then holds it upside down like a miser shaking a purse. You laugh weakly, too tired for much else, but it feels good. The Primus is doused, carefully cooled, tucked back into its case like a child bundled for sleep. Mugs are wiped and stuffed into packs. The snow trench is stomped flat, erased from sight. The wind resumes its dominance, howling over the plateau, but inside you is a small, steady glow that it can't touch. You stand, shoulders stiff, rope tugging again at your chest. The line moves forward step by step back into the endless white. But this time, the rope feels lighter. Not because it is, but because the tea has bribed your brain into believing. Light joke number 3. Explorers may have written about man hauling, but honestly, it was tea that did most of the heavy lifting. You glance back at the faint steam curling away from the trampled trench, already fading into memory. The kettle rides again on the sledge, ready for its next performance. And you, refreshed, scalded tongue and all, lean into the harness with a grunt, comforted by the knowledge that another brew-up lies somewhere ahead, waiting to be earned. The tent flaps rustle like pages turning, and you duck your head inside, shaking snow from your parka before it can melt into irritation. The interior is cramped, a pyramid of canvas glowing faintly amber from the lantern's wick, and arranged carefully around the center pole are men sitting cross-legged, knees colliding, mugs already in hand. You realize immediately, this is not just tea time, this is the captain's tea time. At the apex of the tent, propped with a kind of ceremony that ignores the torn canvas at his elbow, sits the captain himself, Scott, Shackleton, or one of their rivals, depending on the voyage you imagine. His cup is porcelain, naturally, its delicate rim a stubborn reminder that civilization has followed him even here. Mainstream historical fact. During Scott's expeditions, officers often maintained a strict sense of decorum during tea in the captain's tent, with men expected to sit properly and conversations flowing in measured tones, as though the blizzard outside were merely a noisy servant. You squeeze in among the others, finding a perch on a box of scientific instruments. The kettle, already hissing on the Primus, provides the soundtrack. The captain pours, slowly, deliberately, as though each stream of tea were an oath. You pass mugs hand to hand, the steam brushing your knuckles. It feels like communion, the leaves standing in for bread and wine. One officer remarks on the weather observations from the morning. Another adds a note about ice conditions along the barrier. There is laughter, but subdued, as though too much noise might shake the tent into collapse.
even jokes feel rehearsed for politeness. You sip from your mug, tin in your case, and the taste is as sharp as ever, though softened by sugar. Quirky tidbit. Shackleton once insisted on formal meals even in the harshest conditions, complete with table settings, arguing that ritual was a weapon against despair. Some diaries note the absurdity of drinking from porcelain, while the walls of the tent flapped so hard they threatened to blow away. The captain lifts his own cup, pinky angled with quiet defiance. The gesture says, "We are still gentlemen," though the snow dripping from his mustache betrays him. Light joke number 1. Nothing screams refinement like sipping Darjeeling while your boots are frozen solid to the tent floor. The kettle runs low and an orderly tips the last dribble into the captain's mug, ensuring his is topped before anyone else's. You notice a glance exchanged among the men. Not resentment exactly, but awareness. Hierarchy doesn't melt just because the ice tries to. Historians still argue whether such insistence on formality strengthened morale or only deepened divisions between officers and men. Was the porcelain cup a symbol of leadership or a fragile reminder of class? No one agrees. Conversation drifts to letters from home, imagined or remembered, men describing hearths and Sunday roasts, the smell of coal fires and the chatter of pubs. Someone quotes a line of poetry, badly, earning a round of polite chuckles. The captain smiles thinly, content that the tone remains civilized. Meanwhile, the lantern flickers, the stove splutters, and outside, the wind punches the canvas like an impatient creditor. You can't help but notice the contrast. Nature is trying to erase you, and here you are discussing the proper order of milk and tea. The tea itself tastes no better in the captain's tent than in the snow trench, but somehow it feels heavier, as though expectation has steeped alongside the leaves. You take a slow sip, careful not to slurp. The warmth still works its miracle, melting the stiffness in your fingers, untying the knots in your shoulders. Yet you can't help thinking you'd enjoy it more hunched in your own corner, slurping noisily with no one watching. Light joke number 2. Etiquette makes everything taste slightly of cardboard, even when it's scalding hot leaf water. When the mug's empty, the captain clears his throat, setting his porcelain cup down with precision. The signal is clear. Tea time has ended. Men shuffle out one by one, ducking into the storm again, shoulders hunched. You linger a moment, glancing at the china cup gleaming faintly in the lantern light, absurdly out of place. You wonder how many more voyages it will endure before shattering on the snow. Outside, the wind gnaws at your hood immediately, and you exhale a plume that vanishes into darkness. You realize the tea has done its work. Not just warming bodies, but proving that even here, hierarchy and ritual still have teeth. You tug your scarf higher, amused at the memory of pinkies extended in the world's most ridiculous battlefield. Light joke number 3. Someday, perhaps, historians will write not about endurance or discovery, but about the great Antarctic pinky uprising of 1912. You step back toward your own tent, mug clutched tight, and the snow crunches underfoot. Behind you, the captain's tent glows like a lantern in a cave, fragile but insistent. You grin despite yourself. In a place where everything freezes, even ceremony manages to simmer. The tent flaps close again, and silence folds over the camp like a quilt of snow. You sit cross-legged on your sleeping bag, mug in your lap, and notice how the room changes once the talking dies down. The men breathe in rhythm, a chorus of sighs and sips. The only sound left is the clink of spoons and the occasional hiss from the Primus as it cools. The silence between sips becomes its own ceremony, as if the tea has coaxed the noise out of everyone and left behind a fragile stillness. You blow gently across the surface of your mug, the steam swirling like ghost handwriting, and the taste is suddenly brighter because no one's voice interrupts it. You glance around and see eyelids drooping, shoulders slumping, men letting themselves soften into the moment. Mainstream historical fact. Diaries from Antarctic expeditions often note that tea time was the single calm interval of the day, when even the most stubborn personalities paused their quarrels to savor a cup. The ritual was as much about silence as about flavor. You sip again, holding the warmth in your mouth before swallowing, and the world feels briefly under control. Quirky tidbit. One explorer wrote that the silence at tea reminded him of Quaker meetings he'd attended as a child, everyone communing inwardly. Except the deity here was a chipped enamel mug. You grin at the thought, though you keep the grin private. The quiet isn't empty. It's layered. Outside, the wind scrapes the tent walls like a giant fingernail. Snow slides off the canvas with a muffled whoomp. The kettle sighs as it cools, the sound like a satisfied sleeper. Inside, breaths deepen, and every so often, someone clears a throat softly, unwilling to break the spell too loudly. Light joke number 1. In any other place, this level of awkward silence would demand someone tell a joke. In Antarctica, it's just the tea doing its job. You think about how much of the day is noise, sledges groaning, dogs barking, officers calling, boots crunching, ropes straining, and realize how rare it is to have a pause that doesn't require effort. This silence feels earned, not enforced. Historians still argue whether these quiet intervals were deliberate discipline from officers, or simply exhaustion silencing everyone. Either way, the result is the same: a shared calm that makes the next march possible. Your fingers trace the dent on your mug. It's cool at the rim now, warm at the base, as if it holds 2 climates at once. You take another sip, slower this time, letting the flavor drift across your tongue. Someone nearby sighs in unison, and you can't help but smile. It's as if the tea itself has become a conductor, guiding the orchestra of exhaustion toward harmony. One man sets his empty mug down with exaggerated care, the softest clink you've ever heard. Another leans back against a tea chest, eyes closed, steam still rising from his mustache. You close your eyes too, just for a second, and the darkness behind your lids feels softer than the canvas above. Light joke number 2. You realize you've accidentally invented a new genre: tea-induced group napping. When you open your eyes again, the lantern light has dimmed slightly, the wick needing a trim. The shadows on the canvas ripple with the wind outside, but inside no one moves quickly. The mugs are nearly empty, and yet no one is rushing to pour the last dribble from the kettle. It's as if holding onto silence is more valuable than refilling. You nod at this, recognizing the wisdom of stretching peace as far as it will go. Finally, someone breaks the spell with a small chuckle, a private thought shared aloud. The room stirs, shoulders lift, mugs rattle again. The silence dissolves, replaced by chatter about sledges and socks and blisters. The moment is gone, but it leaves behind a residue, like sugar clinging to the bottom of a cup. Light joke number 3. If silence could be bottled, it would probably outsell the condensed milk. You gather your own mug, tipping it for the last lukewarm swallow, and set it down with care. The warmth has faded, but the calm lingers. Outside, the wind sharpens its claws again, but you know you've stolen a little sanctuary from it. Tomorrow will bring hauling, shouting, barking, and creaking ropes, but tonight you've had silence. 5 perfect minutes between sips, where the world paused long enough for you to breathe. You wake to find your mustache frozen into a brittle mask, your breath stitched with frost, and the mug you left on the snow bench now holds not tea, but a solid block of brown ice. You wrap it with your spoon and it clinks like a bell. The joke writes itself. Antarctica, the only place where your tea becomes a popsicle before you can complain it's too hot. Light joke number 1. Unless you actually wanted to drink it, in which case the humor is delayed until spring. The kettle sulks on the Primus, refusing to boil quickly. You watch the steam sputter and vanish before it even clears the rim, devoured by the cold. Mainstream historical fact. On the polar plateau, where temperatures often plunge below 40, explorers found that their tea froze in mugs within minutes. Even the act of lifting a cup to the lips was a race against solidification. Diaries from Scott's final march describe tea that had to be chipped free of ice before it could be swallowed. You cradle your mug anyway, knowing it will cool too fast, but determined to sip. The first swallow is still liquid, but by the second, a thin skin forms on top, a fragile sheet you break with your spoon. It feels less like drinking and more like excavating. Quirky tidbit. Some men carried their mugs under their coats after pouring, using their own bodies as insulation, though this sometimes ended with tea spilled down the front of their sweaters, an indignity described in one diary as burning frost. You sip quickly, tongue scalded, lips burning, but it doesn't matter. The liquid is racing to become solid again. One man nearby mutters that he should have chewed his tea leaves raw. Another jokes about inventing tea jerky. Laughter rolls briefly, teeth chattering between the chuckles. The absurdity makes it bearable. The kettle's second round is poured, and this time you don't wait. You gulp greedily, ignoring etiquette, because here, manners freeze faster than tea. Light joke number 2. Imagine a high society tea party where every guest is required to drink, like they're entering a speed slurping contest. That's Antarctica. Still, there's a strange beauty in it. The way the steam curls like silk before being torn away by the air. The way ice forms along the mug's rim, delicate as lace, even as the center still steams. You stare, mesmerized, and think of stained glass windows back home. For 1 second, you could almost call it art. Historians still argue whether these freezing conditions pushed morale to breaking or forged stronger bonds. Some accounts say the frustration of losing tea to ice deepened despair. Others claim that shared laughter over frozen mugs became a unifying memory, proof that survival meant finding humor in absurdity. You sip again, faster now, and decide both might be true. One explorer beside you turns his mug upside down to show a perfect brown ice cylinder sliding out, tea transformed into sculpture. He sets it on the snow wall like an ornament. Everyone claps weakly, too cold for genuine applause. You laugh anyway, the sound thin but real. You try again with a fresh pour, cupping the mug between your hands, blowing across the surface like you're coaxing a reluctant fire. The warmth seeps in, just enough to loosen your fingers. You drink in gulps, knowing hesitation is punished here. Light joke number 3. If there's ever an Olympic event for fastest tea drinking, Antarctic explorers already qualified a century ago. When the last drops are swallowed or frozen, you set your mug down carefully, tapping the ice flakes free with your spoon. Around you, men scrape at their cups, chewing fragments of frozen tannin, determined not to waste a single bit. The kettle hisses its protest, nearly empty, and the Primus flickers low. Outside, the wind prowls, uncaring. You tuck your mug inside your parka, holding it close for warmth, even though it's empty. The gesture is more about comfort than utility, a reminder of what it once held. Tomorrow, the same ritual will play out again. Hot water defying cold air, tea daring to remain liquid, men racing their mugs. And though you know most of it will freeze, you also know that even one gulp of warmth is enough to carry you another mile across the plateau. You rub your hands together until sparks of warmth return, then lift the kettle again, not because anyone is thirsty, but because tea has become the closest thing you have to medicine. The doctor of the expedition nods approvingly, jotting in his notebook, as though he's just prescribed a miracle in leaf form. Mainstream historical fact. Tea was used liberally in polar expeditions as a treatment for exhaustion, seasickness, frostbite morale, and even digestive complaints, though it offered little true nutrition. Doctors recommended it less for chemistry than for comfort. You sip slowly, letting the tannins scrape your tongue clean, and feel the warmth seep down your throat into places no salve could reach. Someone with frostbitten toes groans, clutching his mug to his chest as if it might radiate through boots and socks. He whispers that it's worth more than morphine, and no one argues. Quirky tidbit. One diary recorded a man applying lukewarm tea directly to his face after windburn, convinced it soothed the sting better than ointment. The doctor did not endorse this method, but the man swore by it. Tea also stood guard against the gnawing menace of scurvy, or at least it pretended to. With lime juice supplies sometimes spoiled or rationed too thin, explorers clung to the belief that tea, brewed strong and often, might keep illness at bay. Historians still argue whether its benefit was real or placebo, but the placebo was potent. A man who believed his cup contained health walked taller afterward, and sometimes belief alone buys another mile. You cradle your mug against your cheek, feeling the heat spread into stiff muscles. The steam washes your face in a humid blessing, a relief after air so dry it seems to erase moisture from your bones. One companion dips his fingers directly into his tea, sighing as the warmth revives his cracked knuckles. He earns mock scolding, "That's wasting good brew." But no one stops him. Light joke number 1, if there were a spa menu here, the only treatments would be tea hand soak and tea facial with optional biscuit crumbs. The sick and seasick receive extra mugs. On the voyage south, when the seas pitched men against the bunks, the steward made endless rounds with the kettle, balancing like a circus act. Many swore the ship's groaning felt less sinister with hot liquid in hand. Even now, weeks off the water, the memory lingers. The smell of coal smoke, salt, and tannins braided together into a strange, steady comfort. You think of nights when exhaustion nearly erased your will to rise. The promise of tea tugged you upright, one small reason to crawl from the sleeping bag. A mug becomes a talisman, a token of tomorrow. It isn't food, not really, but it tricks the stomach into believing, and sometimes trickery is the finest medicine. Someone nearby recalls Shackleton's 1907 Nimrod expedition, when he rationed tea so carefully that the crew nicknamed the kettle the Doctor. You laugh softly, because the title fits. The doctor in this tent, the real one, doesn't object. He knows morale does as much work as salves and poultices. Light joke number 2, ask any Antarctic explorer for their medical chart, and under prescriptions, it probably just says tea, repeat until morale improves. You watch the frostbitten man smile faintly as the warmth seeps back into his fingers. Another stirs his tea with a biscuit stub, softening it into mush that he swallows greedily, eyes closed in relief. These aren't meals, they're bandages disguised as flavors. Historians still argue whether explorers underestimated the importance of nutrition in favor of symbolic comforts. Was tea a distraction from the real medical needs, or was it exactly the treatment that kept men sane long enough for other remedies to matter? No consensus exists, and perhaps there never will be. You sip again, thinking you don't care. You'd rather have this mug than any lecture on vitamins. The kettle empties, mugs drain, and the silence grows heavy again. Men wipe their mustaches, lick their spoons, and lean back with expressions that, if not healthy, are at least less hollow. The doctor closes his notebook with a snap, satisfied that medicine has been dispensed in sufficient doses. You set your mug down and feel the warmth echo in your chest long after the liquid is gone. Light joke number 3. If insurance companies ever covered tea therapy, half the world's hospitals would just be cafes with extra blankets. Outside, the wind sharpens its claws once more, but for the moment, inside the tent, you are healed. Not cured, perhaps, but healed enough to keep moving. Tomorrow will bring more frostbite, more exhaustion, more whispered worries about scurvy. But tonight, you know you have a prescription that always refills. Water, leaves, flame, patience. A doctor's signature in steam. The kettle wobbles on the Primus, steam coiling like a stubborn thought, and you notice the way eyes sharpen whenever the lid rattles. Tea is about to be poured, and that means rations will be tested. A ladle in the wrong direction could spark more outrage than a lost sledge. You measure carefully, trying to appear impartial, though you already know someone will grumble. Mainstream historical fact: rationing was a constant friction on Antarctic expeditions, with tea measured to the ounce per man per day, and complaints about short measure appearing in journals almost as often as complaints about frostbite. You pour one mug, then another, and sure enough, the muttering begins. "That's a bit generous, isn't it?" someone says, eyeing the portion given to his neighbor. "He's got a larger cup." Another replies, "My cup's no bigger than your temper." The exchange earns chuckles, but the undercurrent is sharp. You sip your own portion quietly, aware that the line between laughter and resentment here is as thin as a tea stain. Quirky tidbit: one wintering crew once weighed each mug of tea with a scale borrowed from the scientific instruments, just to prove that no one was cheating the ration. The ritual turned tea time into a courtroom, with the steward as judge and jury. You imagine the absurdity, men squinting at ounces of liquid like jewelers appraising diamonds. Light joke number 1. Somewhere, an actual jeweler would have been horrified to learn that brown leaf water was being treated with more reverence than his gems. The debate intensifies when sugar comes out. A spoon clinks into one mug, then two, then stops. Someone coughs meaningfully. "I think you skipped me." Another points to the nearly empty tin. "We're all getting short. Better not play favorites." You glance at the doctor, who pretends not to hear, scribbling in his notebook as if ignoring ration drama might make it vanish. But it doesn't. Historians still argue whether ration disputes damaged morale more than hunger itself, with some diaries describing civil wars in teaspoons. You remember a story from Shackleton's Nimrod expedition. A man caught sneaking extra sugar from the tin earned not punishment but ridicule, the kind that clung for weeks. A nickname followed him across the ice, a reminder that sugar theft was both crime and comedy. Still, the incident was proof that rationing wasn't just arithmetic. It was moral judgment, a mirror held up to character. The kettle empties faster than expected, and here comes the real trouble. Someone's mug remains unfilled. He stares at the empty pot, face stiff, and mutters a curse under his breath. The steward shrugs helplessly. A spoon clatters harder than necessary against a mug. The silence after that clatter is heavy, thicker than the canvas walls. Light joke number 2. It's the Antarctic version of flipping the board in a family game of Monopoly. Except no one can storm off because there's nowhere to storm. You glance into your own cup and wonder whether to share. It's tempting, an easy way to buy goodwill, but it also means you'll run short yourself later. That's the constant equation. Generosity buys peace, but at a personal cost. You tip half your mug into his anyway. He nods gruffly, not quite gratitude, but something close. The air loosens again. Conversation returns. Later, when the men are lying in their bags, you hear whispers. Tomorrow, smaller scoops. Or weigh the mugs. Or make the officer pour, see if he does better. You close your eyes, smiling faintly, because ration disputes always bloom into bedtime debates. Historians still argue whether stricter rationing on Scott's 1911, the 12th of March, doomed the party to failure, or whether no amount of tea could have outweighed the weather and distance. You sip the memory of your half portion and suspect both sides are right. Light joke number 3. If there were a Nobel Prize for grumbling, early Antarctic expeditions would have swept the category year after year. The next morning, the ritual repeats. Kettle, mugs, spoons, sugar. Complaints simmer again, like water not quite boiling. And yet, despite all the grumbles, everyone drinks, everyone warms, everyone shoulders their harness again. Tea rations may spark arguments fiercer than strategy meetings, but they also keep men moving forward. The irony makes you laugh softly into your mug. Arguments aside, the truth is simple. Without tea, there'd be no expedition left to argue. You sit on a tea chest with your knees pulled up, notebook balanced awkwardly, pencil stub gripped in mittened fingers. The lantern flickers above, smoke smudging the canvas, and you try to think of something worth recording for whoever might read your diary decades later. What comes to mind first is not the miles of sledge hauling or the scientific measurements of wind speed. It's the taste of this morning's tea. You write, "It was almost like home," then pause, frown, and add, "though colder and quicker to freeze." Mainstream historical fact, many explorers filled their journals and letters with references to tea, describing its comfort in language usually reserved for family or firesides. The brew served as a bridge between the barren whiteness outside and the hearths they had left behind. You lean back and imagine sending such a line to England, where a kettle whistles beside a coal fire. Perhaps your words would reach a wife, a mother, or a sweetheart who would read them and smile, picturing you warmed by the same ritual she practices every afternoon. Quirky tidbit. Some expedition letters even included pressed tea leaves or empty wrappers, tokens sent home as proof of comfort snatched in the ice. One woman later kept her husband's tea wrapper folded into her prayer book for the rest of her life. Your pencil scratches again. Tea here is not just drink, it is memory. Each sip is a reminder of England's green hedgerows and the chatter of neighbors across the fence. You pause, suddenly self-conscious, wondering if you sound too sentimental, but you leave it on the page anyway. Out here, sentiment is survival. Someone across the tent mutters about his own letter, trying to capture the absurdity of drinking from a dented sardine tin while snow filters through a hole in the canvas. Another insists he'll describe how the steam frosted his eyelashes, turning him into a tea-drinking icicle. Laughter follows, soft but real. Light joke number 1. If these diaries ever get published, future readers might think Antarctica was just one long tea party with inconvenient weather. The act of writing itself feels like steeping leaves. You drop memories into the water of paper and let them bloom. You describe the clink of spoons, the sigh after the first sip, the way sugar dissolves into swirls like small galaxies. You even sketch your mug's dent, a crooked crescent, noting it for posterity. Who knows? Perhaps a museum will one day display it beside your words, as though the dent were history itself. Historians still argue whether these sentimental passages about tea reveal weakness or resilience. Some claim they show the men were clinging to trivial comforts instead of focusing on survival. Others argue the opposite, that by honoring such small rituals, they proved their strength, refusing to let the ice erase their humanity. You look at your own words and decide you'll side with the second camp. Weakness doesn't write letters. You fold the page and tuck it into the envelope pile, each addressed in a scrawl that may or may not ever reach its destination. The letters are sealed but never certain, entrusted to ships that may never sail back. Yet men keep writing them anyway, as if the act itself guarantees return. Light joke number 2.
It's the world's least reliable postal service. Stamps optional. Survival required. Later, as you sip the last of your tea, you imagine the warm kitchens where your words might one day be read. A kettle on the hob, a cat curled on the rug, someone laughing at your silly description of frozen mustaches. The thought is so vivid you nearly taste coal smoke and hear the rattle of London trams. The mug in your hand becomes a telephone line across oceans. You set the diary aside and blow gently on the page, ink smudging slightly in the damp air. Around you, men do the same, scribbling lines about blizzards, blisters, and, inevitably, bruise. The sound of scratching pencils blends with the hiss of the kettle, both instruments of continuity. Light joke number 3. If future historians ever want to know how explorers survived, they should skip the meteorological charts and just publish a cookbook called 100 Ways to Write About Tea. You close the notebook, slip it under your sleeping bag for safekeeping, and cradle your mug one last time. Tomorrow's miles will be long and cold, but tonight your words are already halfway home, carried on the steam rising from your cup. The kettle sings softly, the steam threading upward like a signal flag, and you notice how differently each man handles the ritual. For some, tea is a naval ceremony. Porcelain, saucers, milk in first, pinky angled just so. For others, it's an improvised gulp from a tin mug, no ceremony, just heat in the belly. In this little tent at the bottom of the world, cultures collide in steam. Mainstream historical fact: early Antarctic expeditions were rarely homogeneous. Officers often came from Britain's naval tradition. Scientists hailed from universities or museums. Sailors might be recruited from Scotland, Norway, or Newfoundland. And stokers, cooks, and deckhands often represented working-class corners of empire. Each man brought his own idea of what proper tea looked like. You watch as one sailor, broad-shouldered and irreverent, spoons in 3 lumps of sugar, stirs twice, and downs half his mug before the others have even lifted theirs. Across from him, a Norwegian scientist blows gently, savoring small sips, his mustache frosting delicately with each exhale. Meanwhile, the officer insists on order. Milk first, then pour, then stir clockwise. Quirky tidbit: one scientist on Shackleton's endurance expedition apparently brewed his tea so weak that his tent mates mocked it as hot sigh water. He defended it as continental taste, which did nothing to protect him from jokes. Light joke number 1. If Antarctica had Yelp reviews, half of them would be British officers leaving 1-star ratings for their shipmates' scandalous brewing methods. The tent fills with laughter at the differences. A sailor tries to sip daintily, pinky extended, spilling half the mug on his trousers. The officer glares, but the scientist chuckles, and soon everyone joins in. Tea, meant to unify, also highlights the absurd variety of habits. You realize this is part of the charm. The leaves don't discriminate, but the drinkers certainly do. Historians still argue whether these small cultural rituals smoothed over class divides or sharpened them. Some diaries praise the shared warmth as a leveling force, while others note that officers and men often still brewed and drank separately, each guarding their customs. The debate mirrors the steam itself, swirling, rising, dissipating without clear resolution. You take your own sip, tilting your mug at just the right angle to avoid the chipped rim, and imagine all the kitchens represented here: Scottish hearths, English parlors, Norwegian farmhouses, Irish ship galleys. Each man has carried his own ghost of home southward, and now all those ghosts are crowding this tent, glaring at one another's teacups. Light joke number 2. It's the world's strangest multicultural summit, and the agenda item is milk before tea, yes or no. The kettle hisses louder, demanding attention. You pour another round, watching as each man adjusts the ritual to his own code. The officer stirs precisely 3 times. The sailor dunks his biscuit until it disintegrates, then fishes the mush with a grin. The scientist takes notes in his field journal about the morale effects of tea strength, an entry destined to baffle future archivists. Outside, the wind claws the canvas, a reminder that nature has no interest in etiquette. Yet inside, these tiny battles over mugs and spoons feel important. They remind each man that he is still himself, not just a number in the frost. Quirky observation becomes survival. Individuality maintained through ritual. Light joke number 3. You imagine Amundsen and Scott standing side by side, arguing not about routes or sledging rations, but about whether the milk goes in first.
History books would be much shorter if that had been the real conflict. The tea dwindles. Some mugs are drained quickly, others savored. The differences remain, but the warmth is shared. You set the kettle down, empty now, and realize that cultural collisions here are less like battles and more like dances. Awkward, sometimes messy, but proof that the world has followed you even to this white emptiness. As you settle your mug into the snow wall, you smile faintly. Tomorrow, the debates will begin again. About strength, about sweetness, about order. But tonight, the tent holds its mismatched rituals like a patchwork quilt, stitched together by steam. The tent flaps thrash like wet laundry on a line, the poles groan, and outside the storm bellows with a throat full of knives. You huddle tighter into the sleeping bag, but then comes the inevitable whisper. Time for tea? Of course it is. Tea waits for no weather, not even a whiteout that's trying to erase the continent itself. Mainstream historical fact. Expeditions often kept brewing even during storms, using Primus stoves inside tents despite the fire hazard, because hot liquid was considered essential for morale. In diaries from the Terra Nova and Endurance, men described the absurdity of balancing kettles while canvas snapped above their heads like gunfire. You pull the Primus closer, shielding the flame with your body. The kettle rattles on its ring, steam bursting sideways as gusts squeeze through every stitch in the canvas. Around you, men cup their mugs in trembling hands, ready for the pour. The storm roars, but inside the tent, attention narrows to one fragile blue flame. The first pour sloshes wildly as the kettle bucks in your grip. Half goes into the mug, half onto the snow floor, where it sizzles and vanishes. The man receiving it doesn't complain. He just slurps immediately, desperate to drink before the storm steals it again. Quirky tidbit. One explorer once described tea on a plate, when the kettle tipped mid-pour, flooding saucers and biscuit tins instead of mugs. The men drank from whatever caught the spill, laughing through chattering teeth. You manage a steadier pour into your own mug and lift it carefully. The steam curls around your nose, hot against air so cold it feels like needles. You sip and the heat races down your chest, thawing just enough space inside for relief. Around you, the others do the same, each gulp synchronized with the tense, heaving rhythm. Light joke number 1. It's like drinking in a roller coaster car, except the ride lasts 8 hours and no one asks for tickets. The storm presses harder, and snow blasts through a tiny gap in the canvas, peppering your sleeve. Someone laughs bleakly. A little sugar, a little snow. Good balance. Another shakes his mug, noting that it already has ice forming around the rim despite the heat inside. You sip faster, knowing every second is a race against freezing. Historians still argue whether brewing inside tents during blizzards was reckless or necessary. Some say it risked fire and suffocation. Others point out that without hot tea, morale would have collapsed entirely. Looking at your mug, you can't imagine choosing to forego it. Even a burned tent feels like a lesser disaster compared to facing a storm with nothing warm in your stomach. The kettle empties again too quickly, and everyone eyes the snow blocks stacked inside for melting. You feed another chunk into the pot, listening to it hiss like a cat thrown into water. The storm rattles louder, drowning conversation, but the promise of another round keeps men steady. It is astonishing, really, how one humble ritual can steady hands that just hours ago were numb with fear. Light joke number 2. If tea were a religion, the Antarctic storm is the devil, and the Primus stove is the only exorcist anyone trusts. You pour again, this time more carefully, crouched low to keep the kettle steady. The mugs line up like supplicants, each filled halfway, enough to remind every man that he hasn't been forgotten by the universe. The sips come quickly, then silence follows, punctuated only by the roar of the gale. The storm outside is chaos. The tea inside is order. The lantern flickers, nearly extinguished, and shadows leap across the canvas like nervous animals. Someone mutters a story from a calmer day, a sledging tale, perhaps just to distract from the fear. You nod along, blowing across your mug, even though you can barely hear the words over the wind. What matters is the rhythm. Sip, sigh, listen, endure. Light joke number 3. If future archaeologists find the remains of this camp, they might assume the explorers worshipped kettles as protective gods. Honestly, they wouldn't be far wrong. When the final mug's empty, men lie back against their bags, soothed enough to close their eyes despite the storm's fury. The kettle cools with a little hiss, the flame gutters low, and you pull the blankets tighter. Outside, Antarctica continues to scream, but inside, you've built a sanctuary out of steam and discipline. You drift towards sleep with the taste of tannin on your tongue, proof that even in the heart of a blizzard, comfort is possible, measured one mug at a time. The morning begins with an oddly hollow sound, the rattle of a nearly empty tin. You tip it upside down, and only a faint scattering of leaves slides out, more dust than substance. The noise is sharp, metallic, the kind of sound that makes every head turn. Tea is running out. Mainstream historical fact. By the later stages of sledging journeys, expeditions often found their tea rations reduced to a mere handful of leaves per man, sometimes stretched by re-steeping or drying for reuse. Scott's Polar Party in 1912 noted in their diaries that their brews grew weaker and weaker, a parody of tea as the tins neared exhaustion. You scoop the fragments into the pot anyway, adding snow and waiting for the flame to coax some flavor from what remains. The steam rises thinner, paler, reluctant. Around you, the men lean forward, eyes fixed on the kettle as though watching a patient on a sickbed. When you pour, the liquid is the color of weak amber glass, translucent and disappointing. Someone mutters, "Looks like dirty snowmelt," but drinks it anyway. Quirky tidbit. One wintering party at Cape Adare joked that the last leaves should be steeped in champagne to mark the occasion. Of course, no champagne was available, so they simply toasted with the weakest brew imaginable. You imagine the absurdity of lifting mugs of tinted water and calling it a celebration. The first sip confirms it. The flavor is ghostly, a shadow of what tea once was. And yet you savor it, because the ritual matters more than the taste. Light joke number 1. You tell yourself it's artisan cold brew, the sort that would sell for 10 shillings in a fashionable cafe, if only anyone could bottle Antarctic misery. When the pot is scraped clean, the leaves are dried on a tin plate beside the Primus. They'll be used again tomorrow, maybe the day after. Each round gets weaker, but no one dares throw them away. Someone even jokes about chewing the damp leaves outright, a shortcut to disappointment. Historians still argue whether stretching rations like this was wise economy or just psychological theater. Did weak tea genuinely help, or was it the idea of tea that mattered? Either way, the leaves keep cycling, like ghosts refusing to depart. The ration book tells the truth in its blunt arithmetic. Tins nearly empty, no resupply ahead. A murmur of worry passes through camp. Tea has been the compass of morale, the punctuation of days, and the thought of losing it altogether is like staring into a blank page with no end. You pour the last dregs into your mug, swirling the leaf dust that settles like silt. The taste is bitter, but you force yourself to smile. Light joke number 2. Congratulations. You've just invented extra textured tea, complete with chewing, a delicacy no one asked for. Later that evening, the final spoonful is measured into the pot with solemn ceremony. No one speaks until the mugs are filled. The silence is thick, reverent. Each man holds his cup as though it were holy. You sip, closing your eyes, letting memory fill in the flavor that the liquid lacks. For a moment, you swear you can taste the first glorious brews of the voyage, strong and fragrant, back when abundance was still possible. Someone lifts his mug and says quietly, "To England," and the rest echo the toast. Steam curls upward like smoke from an altar. When the mug's empty, men set them down gently, as if afraid to wake something. Light joke number 3. You half expect someone to suggest burying the tin with honors, complete with a cross and inscription. Here lies our last leaf, loyal to the end. The tin rattles hollow one final time, then is tucked into the sledge box, not discarded but carried along like a relic. Empty though it is, no one can bear to leave it behind. Tomorrow, the kettle will boil snow alone, perhaps cocoa if any remains, perhaps nothing but hot water. But tonight, you've had the last taste of tea, however faint, and you know it will linger longer in memory than in your mouth. The storm has eased, leaving the camp buried in silence, and you sit with your hands curled around a tin mug that holds only hot water now. No leaves left, not even dust, just warmth. And yet decades from now, when survivors look back, they will write not of blank mugs, but of the brews that once filled them. Tea becomes memory's anchor. Mainstream historical fact. Many memoirs of Antarctic explorers, Scotts, Shackletons, Cherry Garrards, and others, mention tea repeatedly, often with more affection than they describe scientific work or even moments of discovery. In interviews years later, veterans of the heroic age recalled steaming mugs and tents more vividly than they recalled milestones of exploration. You imagine yourself decades older, sitting by a coal fire in England, retelling stories. You wouldn't speak first of glaciers or crevasses. You'd say, "There was this one cup after a sledge haul, best drink of my life." Listeners might smile politely, expecting something grander. But you'd know that no speech about ice shelves or flags would ever compete with the memory of tannins on a frozen tongue. Quirky tidbit. One survivor of Shackleton's endurance expedition claimed he could still smell penguin blubber smoke on his tea 50 years later, as if the flavor had engraved itself permanently on his senses. He swore the memory was so strong he once put down a perfectly good London brew, declaring it too clean. You laugh softly, imagining a future self complaining that tea isn't smoky enough. Light joke number 1, when explorers turned old and grandchildren asked for adventure stories, half probably just ended up describing the greatest cuppa ever made, much to the children's disappointment. You sip your plain hot water now, pretending it has flavor. But your mind overlays memories. The sweetness of condensed milk, the clink of enamel, the warmth creeping into your fingers after hauling ropes. Even absence can taste rich if memory insists.
Historians still argue whether these recollections exaggerate the role of tea, romanticizing a small ritual into a legend. But perhaps exaggeration is inevitable. Who wouldn't magnify the one comfort in a place designed to erase them? The men around you murmur softly, some recounting aloud their own memories. That first sip after hauling on the barrier. The time the kettle nearly tipped in the gale. The night we argued about milk first. Laughter follows, brittle but genuine. The recollections warm the tent almost as much as the kettle once did. You picture a reunion years from now, old shipmates meeting in a London pub. Pints on the table perhaps, but soon enough someone will order tea, just to see the others grin. A silence will fall as mugs are lifted, each man transported back across decades to canvas tents, snow walls, the hiss of Primus flames. Light joke number 2. If time travel ever becomes real, explorers won't visit great events. They'll just go back for one more mug in the ice. The kettle cools, lid rattling faintly, and you stroke the empty tea tin now kept like a relic. The label is faded, the metal dented, but it holds meaning beyond leaves. It's a reliquary, proof that you endured. The stories will outlive the leaves themselves. Someone quotes softly from memory, "Tea, our greatest treasure." Another nods, eyes distant. In that moment, you feel the weight of history leaning forward, ready to preserve this ordinary ritual as extraordinary. Light joke number 3. It's ironic that men risked their lives for flags and maps, yet posterity mostly remembers them as very determined tea drinkers. You stretch out in your bag, closing your eyes, and the steam in your imagination curls higher than the canvas roof. Years from now, when the ice has long melted from your memory, you will still taste this. Hot liquid against cold lips, a warmth no storm could steal, not glory, not tragedy, just tea. The wind prowls outside the tent, steady now rather than savage, and you lift the empty kettle one last time, feeling its weightlessness like a final chapter turning. No more leaves, no more sugar, only memory. Yet in that memory, tea has become larger than life. Ritual, necessity, myth. Mainstream historical fact. Historians and polar writers often highlight tea as more than a drink. In the heroic age of Antarctic exploration, it was a symbol of endurance, a tether to home, and a ritual of order. Scott's diaries, Shackleton's memoirs, even Amundsen's notes mention tea repeatedly, not just for its taste, but for what it represented. You trace your finger around the rim of your mug, recalling the first brews on the ice, strong, fragrant, brimming with sugar and condensed milk. You remember the arguments over rations, the laughter at sardine tin mugs, the etiquette debates in the captain's tent. Each cup was both trivial and monumental. Quirky tidbit. One polar historian once joked that the Antarctic was conquered not by sledges or flags, but by kettles, spoons, and the stubborn will to boil water at -40. It's the kind of remark you'd chuckle at now, sitting here with chapped lips and no leaves left. Light joke number 1. If myths usually begin with swords and stones, Antarctic myth begins with spoons and mugs. Less glamorous perhaps, but far warmer. You think about the arguments scholars still have. Was tea primarily fuel for morale,
or just empty ritual disguising the lack of real sustenance? Did it save men from despair, or merely delay it? Historians still argue whether Scott's party perished despite tea or survived as long as they did because of it. Perhaps both are true. Perhaps a brew is never just liquid, but also belief, and belief can stretch further than calories. The kettle cools with the soft sigh, and you imagine decades from now, exhibitions in museums, battered mugs behind glass, enamel chipped, porcelain cracked, tins stamped with shipping marks. Visitors lean close, whispering, "They carried this all the way to Antarctica." You smile at the thought. Light joke number 2. No one will ever display the heroic sock that froze solid, but they will always enshrine the mug. Priorities, rightly chosen. The tent is quiet now. Men rest with their mugs cradled even when empty, unwilling to put them down. You do the same, because the vessel itself has become comfort. It is no longer about tea, but about the shape of routine, the ritual of lifting, sipping, sighing. And in that stillness, you understand. Tea has turned into memory, and memory has turned into myth. One day, people will read of polar explorers and imagine the flags, the frostbite, the endless marches. But the detail that will linger in their minds will be this: the kettle hissing, the steam curling, the silence between sips. Light joke number 3. If the Antarctic ever wanted a national anthem, it wouldn't be trumpets. It would just be the polite whistle of a kettle. You close your eyes, mug against your chest, and let the myth carry you. The blizzards fade, the snow walls soften, and all that remains is the simple truth. Even at the end of the world, humanity insists on tea time. Now the wind down begins. The kettle's hiss fades into silence. Your mug grows lighter in your hands, and you feel your shoulders loosen, as if the weight of cold itself is lifting away. The canvas above is no longer rattling. It is breathing, slow and calm, a soft canopy over your resting place. You notice your eyelids heavy, your breath deeper, every inhale steady, every exhale releasing. The world around you blurs into white, not harsh or cold now, but soft, like a quiet blanket spread without edges. The snow is no longer enemy, but comfort, cushioning each thought, muffling every sharp corner. You imagine the steam from your last cup still rising, curling slowly upward until it disappears into the air, taking with it the last of your worries. Your body loosens with each imagined sip. The tea has already done its work, warming, soothing, steadying. What lingers is calm, the knowledge that even in the most hostile place on earth, warmth can be created with a simple ritual. And now, in this gentler place, you no longer need to haul, to march, to endure. You only need to rest. So let yourself drift. Feel the tent grow quieter, the world grow softer, the day folding itself into sleep. Somewhere in memory, a kettle whistles faintly, then hushes, as if to say, "Enough, it's time." The mug slips from your hand in a dream, landing safely on snow that welcomes it. You are safe, you are warm, you are done. Sleep now to the rhythm of steam and silence. Sweet dreams.